Hello everybody, thanks for joining us for today's video. In the last couple of videos we've been talking a lot about triggers, so we kind of want to follow up on that and more specifically talk about the way that you think when you're triggered. And what happens is when you become triggered and something happens, some situation you experience, your thinking becomes very rigid and you get very stuck thinking this situation happened exactly like this and only could mean this one thing. So when your brain gets stuck like that, what do you do about it?
Great question. So, one of the things I wanted to throw out there is this idea of what we call the AIP model uh, for those of us that do EMDR therapy, right? But the idea is whether or not our brains have the capacity to adapt new information into an existing framework. I actually find this is a big barrier, and I really liked the way you worded it, so I'll throw it to you. But if our emotions are out of whack through a trigger, maybe our anxiety is heightened, our cognitive functioning decreases, which makes it harder to adapt new information into our existing framework. So, share with these guys how you mentioned it to us before we started filming, because I think that's the perfect idea.
Sure.
In less sciencey words.
Yeah.
I'll try to do less sciencey words. We'll see how that goes. Jaden, because you were just asking, well, what do you do about that? And really, first things first, you have to build the awareness that this is happening. And we don't usually notice that it's happening, but when we become triggered, the part of our brain that's supposed to be in charge of like being open to new information and learning new things, that part of our brain just goes offline. And so instead, we get stuck in a really rigid way of thinking. We think that this is the only way that it could be, and we're ready to die on that hill. Sometimes people notice this most when they get into an argument with a loved one, right? If you get into kind of a heated argument, you might get into this spot where you're no longer regulated. So you're like in fight or flight. And you could say something so smart to your partner and they will not hear you. They will have an argument. Even if what you're saying makes complete sense to the logical brain, they're not going to hear you because they're in fight or flight. They're ready to fight with you. And so they're going to be stuck in that like really rigid thought pattern. And you might be stuck in that really rigid thought pattern too. So I think that it's important to know that that's what happens. When you get triggered, your brain goes offline and you start to perceive things in a really specific way. So if we were going to talk even more specifically, if your emotional energy gets too intense, you're in fight or flight, you start to perceive everything around you as being dangerous. Like people are just out to get you, right?
Yeah.
One time I was in this space when my husband walked in from work, and I immediately thought that he was mad at me, and I made up this whole story in my head of like all of the things that I was going to say to him because I knew he was mad at me, right?
Yeah.
But it's just because I was in fight or flight. It had nothing to do with what was actually going on. He just looked at me with a pretty expressionless face, but I internalized it and perceived it as being something somewhat threatening, right?
Yeah. So it sounds like it can look a lot like personalization.
Yeah, it can, for sure. And then on the other hand, so that's if you get too much energy in your emotions, you're in that kind of hypervigilant state. If you go the other direction though, you find all your energy drops out and you're in hypoarousal, or sometimes we call it this like that freeze state. Then what actually happens is that you don't see things around you as being so much dangerous as you see them being hopeless. You start to think things to yourself like, nobody cares about me anyway. Why would I even try? I'm just worthless, and that's just the way that it is, and there's nothing I can do to change it. So this is just where I'm at, right? Some of these kinds of things are what make us have such rigid ways of thinking and makes it so hard to challenge when we're triggered.
I think too that so I like what you said. The first portion is developing an awareness, which probably also requires that you not be in a hyper or hypo-vigilant state, because then you're more open to adapting new information into your framework, right? So I kind of reiterate the question that Jaden already asked. So what do we do about this? Because last time we talked about triggers and what they do and interventions for triggers. How do we now open up the brain to adapt new information, maybe in order to prevent triggers? Does that sound like a fair question?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we help, or even in our own personal lives, how do we open ourselves up to adapting new information in?
Yeah. Well, one of the things is you got to be aware of where you're at in that like window of tolerance. So, do you have too much energy in your emotions or not enough? You've got to know where you're at so that at least you can bring yourself back to a middle ground somewhere. I think in previous episodes we've talked about doing things like self-soothe and grounding, even maybe some breathing, things like that, just to bring the intensity of your emotional energy down. But once you're there, I think that it's a really good idea to remind yourself that you're not a closed-minded person. I don't know anybody who likes to think of themselves as being really
No,
closed-minded.
I don't think anyone thinks of themselves that way.
I don't think so either. And if you're not a closed-minded person, then this means that you are going to be using this skill that's called radical openness. Radical openness means that you know that you don't know it all. Right?
Okay.
You're aware that you don't know it all, and you're open to new ideas and new ways of thinking. And new ways of thinking aren't dangerous for you. This is why I'm saying, you can't be in that complete, hyper arousal state when you're doing this. You have to bring yourself at least down a little bit to be able to do this. But then when you're down in that space, say to yourself, hey, look, I'm okay not knowing it all, and I think I can learn something new. So then you take whatever that rigid thought is that you're having that you think could be no different, and you're saying, okay, well, or could there be some situations where this isn't entirely true? Is there a way to challenge this at all? Right? Maybe if I give you an example, it'll be easier.
Yeah.
You think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, I think for everybody, because I'm trying to apply that into my own life, and I've not considered, I'm trying to be open, I've not considered that what I practice is radical openness, but maybe that's exactly what I try and do. But yeah, throw out an example.
Okay, so I have quite a few people that I treat that are first responders, police officers, paramedics, and they work a lot with the general public. And one of the thoughts that I often hear is that something along the lines of people suck or the human race is horrible, right? And granted, I got to give it to these people because they work with the hardest,
Sure.
right? They work with some of the hardest situations. But when they become triggered, they often feel like the entire human race is made up of horrible people. And there's no way to challenge that thought. So if you are going to be radically open, that means that when you notice that really rigid thought come up, you stop, you take a breath, you maybe do a little bit of grounding to bring yourself back down to an emotional energy level that's more reasonable. And then you say, okay, all people, always, in every situation, is that really what this means? Or am I open to the idea that maybe there could be other things that are true too? Maybe I see people when they're in their worst state. Maybe I don't get a lot of great experiences with people doing good things for each other. Maybe I'm not actually letting my brain consider the time yesterday when our neighbors did this thing that was really nice and I didn't think that they were terrible people, right? It stops you from making some of those overgeneralizations.
I like that. Thinking about that, I also want to throw out that I think being radically open towards the self is something that's also very difficult to do. I find it interesting / sad at the same time when I will have people come in who will say things like, I'm not important, nobody cares about me, I'm broken. And they'll have a specific incident that demonstrates that. Because let's face it, there are things that people do all the time that make us feel that way, whether those people meant to do it or not. But when I ask them, is there any other reason they might have done or said that thing? No, I can't.
It's got to be it.
Yeah, I can't think of anything else, right? And so I like this concept of radical openness because maybe we need to apply it internally too, which is, oh, maybe I'm not dumb, or maybe I'm not broken. And we have to be radically open to some of our own feelings towards ourselves.
Right.
Yeah. I think, I know I always go to this, but I always think of a role reversal. Because in general, we're just way more critical of ourselves, but also I think it feeds into that idea that when a situation happens, we know exactly why it happened. We know exactly what they were thinking. We know exactly the whole everything. And if you can flip that a little bit, it's easier to say, maybe I don't have all the answers because I don't always act in a way that, or people don't always perceive my actions in the way that I meant them.
Yeah, that's totally true. I think this kind of brings up something that's really important. When you're triggered, it gives you really specific thoughts about yourself, about people in your life, and about the world as a whole, right? When you're triggered, your brain makes like these big overgeneralizations. So maybe it's like, I'm worthless and people around me are terrible and the entire world is hopeless, right?
Sure.
And really radical openness is this idea that only feels true in the moment. It's not that it's true all of the time. Yeah, maybe you feel worthless in that moment, but that doesn't mean you're worthless always in every situation, all of the time, and to everyone, right? So radical openness is just questioning some of these things and saying, well, maybe even this thing that feels true isn't always true.
Yeah, and maybe it's helpful to recognize that, like in other areas of your life, how often are overgeneralizations really true or really accurate or helpful?
Right.
And then maybe apply that to the ones you're doing to yourself.
As I'm sitting here thinking, it kind of makes me think about all of the truth to the statement. The more I learn, or the more I know, the more I realize I don't actually know. And that could be like a radical open philosophy too. I think I know, but the more I know, the more I realize I don't actually know. There's so much more to learn, right?
Yeah.
Huh, radical openness. I like it.
So should that be our intervention for the week?
I think it should. But I think you should tell people what you think about like being open, you know? You remember when you were telling me earlier about like openness and what happens in your brain? I can't remember how you said it, but I liked it.
There's just this guy I like to watch on YouTube, and he talked about keeping an open mind, because that's how we learn, that's how we take in new information, that's how we form ourselves, but not letting your mind be so open your brain falls out. So
Oh yeah, good point.
Isn't that funny?
I do like that.
yeah, I like that one.
Yep. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us. Stay tuned on the channel. We have some good videos coming up, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks.
See you later.